The topic is the EU and welfare tourism. My problem statement is, from a Danish perspective, what are the consequences of free movement of labor and the structural differences within the EU, and how would these affect a convergence of the welfare state? Problems are, what is welfare tourism, and is it an existing problem for the EU member states? What are the general differences between European member states in terms of social policies? And should we move towards the convergence of European welfare states, and which possible consequences will it have for the Danish welfare system? One of the key elements of the single market is free movement of persons and labor, which means that there are no legal restriction on intra-EU mobility. This means equal treatment of all European citizens, equal rights to benefits. However, the problem is that some believe that the free movement of a person causes welfare tourism, and in Appendix 7 it is described as an exploitation of favorable welfare benefits in other member states. And this belief or the belief in welfare tourism is also reflected in Appendix 4. Morten Messerschmidt comments after the ECJ verdict limiting the possibility to reserve social benefits welfare Danish citizens. Here Messerschmidt states that there currently is happening an exploitation of Nordic welfare regimes as a consequence of the equal rights and wage differences causing economic imbalances. He says 9 out of 10 Polish would gain more from receiving welfare benefits in Denmark than working full-time in Poland. So he argues that this leaves a huge pressure on the Danish economic funds. In Appendix 1 is UK's Cameron right to worry about welfare tourism in the EU. We see that in Britain this so-called welfare tourism has caused restrictions on welfare benefits aimed at immigrants. They have a quote from Financial Times saying free movement within the EU needs to be less free. They believe that the Britain should exercise less integration due to welfare tourism. However, the article also claims that there are no clear statistics on whether welfare tourism actually exists in the EU. Appendix 3 is an article from the EU called Impact of Mobile EU Citizens on National Security Systems, and this one claims that on the basis of a report by the Commission from 2013, that it's mainly young, well-educated people that exercise intra-EU mobility. So in general, the vast majority immigrate to work. Welfare tourism is not an existing problem. When we investigate this problem of welfare tourism, it becomes obvious that the discussion has some kind of ideological dimension. Messerschmidt believes that deepening integration of the EU creates financial difficulties in favorable welfare systems such as Denmark, and this tendency can also be seen in Britain, which distance themselves from the key principle of the EU. What are the general differences between European member states in terms of social policies? Well, in Appendix 2, we can see that there are great differences in terms of employment benefits. That Denmark used 2.43% of GDP, and Poland only used 0.42%. We also see differences in terms of the amount of GDP that's spent on healthcare benefits. We see that EU has an average of 8% compared to Poland when 4.51% of GDP. So these numbers illustrate that there are huge differences in the amount of money spent on social policies between the EU member states. And this connects to the different welfare models in the EU. We have the social democratic model that we see in the Scandinavian countries, with a focus on social equality, redistribution, and universalism, which means high public expenditure and high level of taxation. And we can compare this model to liberal, the liberal welfare model, where the focus is on the market and a small state, which means low public expenditure. So yeah, we can see how the ideologies are expressed in these models. Appendix 6 state, Appendix 6, the article, the next supermodel highlights the benefits of the Nordic welfare model. It says the state is popular not because it's big, but because it works. And likewise, we have seen in southern European countries have invested more in social policies. The article also says the Nordics have changed course mainly to the right. So yeah, we see different structural policies in the EU which are seen in previous numbers, and these can be explained by the different welfare models. But it can also be argued that the welfare regimes in the EU are moving towards each other, but there are great differences, and this will lead on to the discussion. Should we move towards a convergence of European welfare states, and which possible consequences will have for the Danish welfare system? It's important to notice that there are different types of convergence, but the social convergence is closely connected to economic convergence. And Barroso believes that we need to rise above national interest. So he believes that EU solidarity and perhaps also convergence is the solution to the economic crisis, because um, by doing this, you can create economic initiatives that will relieve the economic difficulties, in Europe and then also in Denmark. And convergence will also create more balance in the EU. This will include labor market policies and therefore even out wage levels throughout the EU. And this will perhaps decrease the German problem and consequently increase the Danish competitiveness. And this links to the fact that the World Economic Forum highlights current Danish taxation and restrictive labor regulation as a problem in terms of our competitiveness. And this connects to Appendix 6 that calls the Danish model too expensive and unsustainable. So perhaps we should decrease the size of our population, decrease the size of our welfare state. Furthermore, if welfare tourism is an existing problem, convergence of welfare states would mean that the problems of exploitation, which are emphasized by Messerschmitt, no longer would occur. But if we have to argue against convergence, we can also argue that EU is not an OCA, which makes it problematic to lead a common policy in the EU. The structural differences, which were highlighted in question 2, would mean that Denmark would have to compromise and give up sovereignty to a certain degree. And this would be problematic as the Danish welfare system is a big part of the Danish identity. This is seen in Appendix 4, where it's mentioned how Thorning's reforms have been criticized to a large extent, and this confirms the theory of liberal intergovernmentalism. In terms of convergence, it's also relevant to talk about the catch-up convergence, and that countries have different kind of starting points, which makes it difficult to create complete convergence despite parallel trends. We can also ask whether there's enough solidarity right now in the EU to undergo a process of convergence, as states will act according to their own interests, according to the theory of intergovernmentalism. And Britain in Appendix 1 confirms this theory as they have moved away from some of the key principles of the EU, which perhaps shows a lack of solidarity, some would say. So this discussion can be seen from two main perspectives. You could say you're enthusiasts and you're skeptics. In terms of economy and competitiveness, Denmark is likely to have, to some degree, to benefit from convergence. However, the type of deep integration might also cause problems due to the change in terms of ideology, as we will have to move away from our current welfare state, which is an important part of the Danish identity. And this year was seen through the great protests during Torrens reforms. So, conclusion. From a Danish perspective, what are the consequences of free movement of labor and the structural differences within the EU, and how should these consequences affect the convergence of the welfare state? Well, because of structural differences, free movement of labor is possible to have negative consequences, as it can cause welfare tourism, especially in favorable welfare systems such as Denmark. It's more likely to happen. However, on the basis of statistics, it's difficult to prove whether welfare tourism actually is an existing problem. But if it is, it would be problematic for Denmark not to convert to a more common social model due to the principle of equal rights to of to benefit for all EU citizens. However, it's also important to notice that the free movement of labor can have positive economic consequences for Denmark. For example, we see highly educated young people coming to Denmark to work. It can be concluded that the structural differences in the EU are crucial for the past, for the future social model. Even though we have seen a natural development and slight convergence of different welfare regimes, it can be discussed if the differences are too great to reach total convergence of the welfare states. For Denmark, a conversion would most likely mean a compromise of the Danish welfare system, a system which derives from ideological ideas such as redistribution, equality, and universalism, which are ideals which are very important for most Danes.